Apple says that court order asking it to help the FBI by hacking an iPhone is unconstitutional. For some legal expertise, I'm joined by Matt Larson, litigation analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Nice to see you, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
This really looks like it's shaping up to be an epic battle between Apple and the government. In your view, whatever happens here in this case, are we talking about something that will be precedent-setting?
I think so, almost certainly so. The way that Apple has teed up the debate and the way that the government has teed up what they're looking for, it really could set a precedent that rifles through the rest of the industry, depending on what the judge here and ultimately the appeals courts decide to do. The issue here is whether or not Apple can be compelled to create a new portion of software to help the government in its investigation, and kind of what the metes and bounds of Apple's responsibility in order to help the government are.
So Apple said in its response to the court order that said you have to help, that order violates the Constitution. Does it?
That's a great question. We'll see that played out. There are a couple prongs to Apple's arguments that I think are interesting. One is whether Apple needs to actually create this new software in order to help the government is subject to what's called the All Writs Act, which is kind of a catch-all where there's not a specific statute that provides a company or individual needs to help the government or law enforcement execute some kind of search warrant. There's the All Writs Act, which gives the government the ability to do anything that's kind of reasonably possible for people to help it adjudicate different matters. And so what Apple is arguing is that the government has overstepped here, that they've taken an order and issued it to Apple that's going to be unreasonable in Apple's ability to actually manufacture this, or that it's overly burdensome. And then what you touched on, they're raising constitutional arguments as to whether this compels speech in violation of the First Amendment, and whether it also violates them of certain due process rights, whether they're being deprived of liberties, namely kind of what they can or can't do, whether they can decide not to engage in additional code writing or not in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Those two constitutional issues, I think, are maybe more placeholders for appellate arguments down the road. I'm not sure how much those are going to sway the magistrate judge that the case is before right now, but Apple's certainly teeing this up to be a big constitutional battle.
So in the meantime, the U.S. attorneys are going to respond to the Apple filing. That happens in early March, on March 10th. So in light of what Apple says, what's the government's next move? How do you think they respond?
That's a great question. I think the government will, on terms of the constitutional arguments, I think the government is going to try to quash those, try to minimize those, try to distinguish the fact that they are looking for information. The government is obviously going to play up the security concerns. Law enforcement certainly has a legitimate interest in getting the support of different communications companies, different software companies. Executing a warrant for these electronic files isn't as easy as executing a warrant for a house or a physical dwelling. I mean, there are a lot of complications, and there is precedent that technology companies have to help the government execute these kinds of search procedures, but the government is going to try to show that this isn't necessarily an overly burdensome exercise for Apple. They're going to point to Apple's representations that the fix the government is looking for is feasible. It'll take a team of engineers anywhere from 2 to 4, maybe up to 6 weeks to really develop the type of software they're looking for, and they're going to argue that that's not an undue burden on Apple in the meantime.
Matt, very quickly before we go, based on what you know in this case so far, do you think it potentially could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court?
That's certainly a possibility. Like I said, Apple has teed up some constitutional issues. I don't see either party backing down if they lose at any of the next couple stages through district court up to the Ninth Circuit, and then potentially onto the Supreme Court. So we could see a Supreme Court decision on this matter in the next couple of year if it's fast tracked.
Fascinating case. Matt Larson, thank you so much for your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Rhonda Schaffler for TheStreet.